Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. Today's episode is going to be a little bit of a potpourri, sort of a mixture of a couple of things. We will have, or at least I will have, since I'm flying the ship solo today, a what-if scenario that I do want to talk about, but also going to take advantage of, as we are sort of in the holiday season here in the United States between Thanksgiving and Christmas, to do a little bit of housekeeping on today's episode and sort of bring our listeners up to speed about the things that are happening now and some of the other opportunities that exist. And then we'll close out the episode with a brief historical what-if, and I'll explain even what that's about as the episode goes along. Before we get started here today, I'm going to go ahead and drop in a break from one of the folks that helps make the podcast possible. Hope that you stick with us, and I'll talk to you after we're back from that. Here's Don.
And Alexis.
Taking just a quick break from the podcast today to tell you about, again, something that is relatively new for us. So what is this new exciting thing that we're sort of pumped about?
Merchandise.
Merchandise. We're a podcast.
They can have those. They can have items.
Wow, this opens up a whole new world of possibilities. And so what we're referring to here is the fact that you may have been craving, absolutely craving, wondering how in the world you could get your hands on what? Maybe a Fork in Time
T-shirt.
Or coffee mug.
Yeah, coffee mug is a big thing for me.
Or maybe even a cell phone cover or a tote bag or any of the other types of things there. The good news is now you're able to do that. And we found a way to do that works well for us, and we think that will work well for you. So one of the folks that we partnered with is TeePublic. And TeePublic is actually a place for designers to sort of post things that are graphical or art-oriented. I got this idea from another podcast that does this. So we're able to have our logo as an option that you can then put on the various TeePublic apparel. Mm-hmm. So, Alexis, how does it work if you go to our website and click on the link that says get some logoed stuff?
So when you click on that link, it'll take you to the TeePublic site, and you can pick from several different options, which we kind of mentioned. There are other ones too, so you can really pick what you want with our logo on it. And then when you purchase that, we actually get a little help.
Yeah, it's not a lot. This is not going to be I'm not retiring on our TeePublic income ever. But it does offset a little bit of the cost of the show. But more importantly, it's a way of doing this where we don't have a lot of upfront cost in terms of printing, 1,000 T-shirts, because that's the way you get the best rate. So it's just a good way of doing that, taking advantage of the mechanism that TeePublic has in place. So if you enjoy the show and you want to rep the show to those around you, you now have a way to do that through logo apparel and items and all kinds of other stuff, and you can find how to get there by going through the website. So one more time, what is our website address, Lex?
That is aforkintimepodcast.com. You can use that merchandise, and also it'll help you start a conversation with somebody about the podcast too.
Hey, there's an idea. So we hope that you do. Thanks. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Don's sitting in the host chair today. As I mentioned before the break, I'm going to start today's episode really with just a little bit of housekeeping, sort of some overall summary of what's going on with the podcast, but also bringing up to speed on some of the things that will be coming soon. And then we'll actually close out today's episode with something I think that will become a little bit more of a regular feature, and so I'll explain what that is. But first, in the area of housekeeping. For those of you that have been listening to recent episodes, you know that our ever-growing list of contributors and hosts, that now includes not only myself and Alexis as the original founding podcast founders and hosts, but of course now includes Chris Coppola and Eric Rush on a regular basis. I've been expanding our host base, and that's a really important part of growing the podcast. While I certainly still enjoy doing this, and I know Alexis does as well, real life gets in the way of the podcast from time to time. And so having a group of hosts who can alternate those responsibilities, and we can spread out the workload across multiple hosts, also getting multiple points of view and multiple personalities involved in what we do here, as I've said so often along the journey here of A Fork in Time, and then the creation most recently of the room where it happened, is one of the great things about this journey has been meeting some neat people that happen to be interested in history, but just happen to be interesting people to get to know. And so we want to continue to expand that. So one of the things I want to do at the start of this episode, we often do things like this at the end of an episode, is encourage those of you that have been out there lurking and listening. We want you to become engaged, become involved. We almost on every episode reference the website. Invite you to go to the website if you haven't been there. That's www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. And you'll find all kinds of things there, the back library for all the episodes for the shows. You'll find bio information, ways to suggest topics, all the things that we normally reference, ways to support the show. But one of the things that's there you will find is joining the team in addition to giving topical suggestions. So some of you may have no desire at all to be the voice that's heard on the podcast, but you have great ideas about what would make for good episodes. We now have a list of about 40 to 50 topical concepts that have been provided by our listeners over the now 2.5 years that A Fork in Time has been in existence, and many of them are now in the queue. We'll be producing many of those shows in the latter part of December, January, February, and March. Over the next 3 to 4 months, one of the things we've committed to is to work through those lists of topical suggestions. Many of them actually have common themes, and so it'll work very well to work through those topical suggestions, and you'll see the variety that comes from those that are expressed over episodes for the next 3 to 4 months. Of course, during that period of time, we hope to continue to reload with new topical suggestions. And one of the things we're looking to do, as we said we want to do, we haven't probably done as good a job of this as we can or we should, but we want to diversify the time frames and the geography of where we go with our historical what-ifs. And the best ways I know to do that actually are tied with our listeners and the ideas that they bring. Our listeners who have become hosts, those that continue to be guests on a somewhat recurring basis, and those that will join the podcast. So again, this is my call, my suggestion. If you'd like to become part of what we're doing here, we want you. You have that picture of Uncle Sam from like the recruiting poster ahead of World War II. We want you for A Fork in Time or the room where it happened. And you can communicate with us there through the website at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. It seems like we're constantly mentioning the newer addition to our podcast family, the family of two, which is the room where it happened. We're now 5 rooms in on roughly a monthly basis to the room where it happened. Still trying to find what it is. It's different than A Fork in Time because it's intentionally designed to be a place where we can actually talk about the what did, talk about real history. And we can't help there. We find ourselves, we've referenced this a couple of times on past episodes, on the room where it happened, slipping into the historical what if. It's also very easy, as we've talked about here on A Fork in Time, to slip or stay stuck in the historical what did. That was one of the reasons for actually creating an entirely separate show with an entirely separate theme, was to have more flexibility to express the historical what did and talk about that versus just talking about alternate history or counterfactual history. But we invite you to also be part of how we're forming that show into being. Again, the same invitation exists if you'd like to become part of the group of hosts or the group of contributors that are there. That's something you can express to us through what we have there on the website and the ways that you can let us know about that. But also, if you haven't had a chance to check out the room where it happened, there will be links, of course, on the website to how to find the episodes and links in the show notes for this episode of A Fork in Time. One of the things we're going to be very conscious of as we're moving forward is our show length. We're going to have a variety of show lengths. We've in some ways gotten away from some of what I think was one of our strengths, which was doing a really good job of containing most episodes to about 40 minutes to an hour. When you read most things about what makes for a good podcast, they will tell you that a good length is sort of centering in on that 45 to 50 minute episode length. And so we're going to be more conscious of making sure that we're staying in that, while at the same time realizing that we do have the freedom and the flexibility to go with longer episodes. And one of the things that I expect to see moving forward, now that we have a larger group of folks who are producing and recording and are leading out in episodes, is it'll be easier for us to have a variety of episode types, episode topics, but also a variety of links. In fact, one of the things I'd like to introduce today, it'll sort of be the latter part of this episode, is the idea of picking up almost on a short episode. An episode that is intentionally designed to throw out a topic cover it in a very short span of time, the historical what if, or the significance of it as the historical what if, probably not more than 15 or 20 minutes at max. And then see what our listeners think about that topic, and we may find ourselves revisiting that topic from the feedback that comes from it. And so one of the things I hope to see launched when we get shortly into the new year, into 2022, is that you may certainly see weeks that have multiple episode drops, one that's more the normal length of A Fork in Time. That may range, again, up to the slightly less than an hour, or maybe a little bit longer, like some of our longer episodes will on occasion. So you'll see that, but also mixing in intentionally and by design some of the shorts. That won't necessarily be an every week thing. For those of you that are listeners of one of the most popular podcasts in existence, and one of the ones that we've referenced a few times here on the show, that's Stuff You Should Know. That's now part of the iHeart network. If you know that Josh and Chuck are an influence on this show in terms of the style of that show, that's very conversational. We strike an effort to do that here on A Fork in Time. But also one of the things that they introduced a couple of years ago was what they call shorts. Intentional episodes that are kept to about a 15 to 20 minute length. We're going to start mixing that type of episode in to our regular rotation, the episode release thing here on A Fork in Time. And so we'd like your feedback on whether you like that or whether you don't like that. It's also a way sometimes to string maybe a couple of those topics together thematically that in and of themselves don't constitute a single show, but over the course of several discussions may work pretty well together. So we'll be playing with that format. And again, the latter part of this episode will be an example of that format that's rolled out as well. The final thing that we want to do is actually encourage our listeners to really, really, really help us get the word out. We know that what we do here at A Fork in Time is sort of a niche. Alternate history is not for everyone. And so we recognize that we're never going to be the most popular podcast anywhere in existence, but we're looking for your help to get the word out. And so what I'd like to encourage each one of our regular listeners, if you are regular listeners, make it a point to at least mention to one or two people that you know who might be interested about the podcast, and encourage them to at least take a listen. If you have your favorite episode, maybe you want to point them to a particular episode that you've enjoyed or you think might strike their interest. There's the complete list of all of our episodes, and they can be found there on the website. So if you're looking for a topic, that's a good place to go and figure out what might be a good episode to suggest to someone and see if you can get them hooked. We know that the best means of promoting something is word of mouth, and through social media. We have our Facebook page and our Facebook group for both A Fork in Time and The Room Where It Happened, Twitter, the various other ways that the word can get out to various folks about what's going on. We would encourage you to do that. Help us get the word out. One of our points of pride is to try not to actually do paid advertising or do other things that promote the podcast in that way. And so we rely upon you, our listeners, to sort of get the word out. One of our goals actually for 2022 is to double the number of listeners, and we'll sort of keep our listeners up to speed and up to date on how we're progressing and how that's working as we go throughout the year 2022. 2022 is going to be a banner year. As has been mentioned a couple of times on various episodes for the various shows, Alexis is getting married in early 2022. Part of the reason she's taken a little bit of a step back now in terms of being actively involved on as many episodes is she has a lot of things going on, new job, that relationship, a lot of things that are happening. So we've given her the freedom and the permission to step back, and that's why it's been so nice to have on the Fork in Time side folks like Chris and Eric, who've come along now as being regular hosts and regular contributors that are producing some of our episodes directly on their own, but also the other folks that join us on The Room Where It Happened, folks like Robert, some of the other folks that you've heard there that are a big part of what we do on that show. So again, one of the themes here today is we want more people. The more people that we have, the more diversity that we have, and the easier that this process becomes as we continue to build a podcast family and a community. Alexis and I have used that word for a long time now, almost since the very first episodes of what we're looking to build here, which is a community. So the last thing I wanted to mention today are two things. Now think about, there's two things I want to mention. We do often just in a passing sense mention the idea of becoming a patron, which is supporting us via Patreon. And as we've said all along here, our goal in doing this podcast has not been to retire to a beautiful mountain cabin that is duly appointed because of the money that we've made from this podcast. If we're looking to do that, we picked the wrong subject to do it in with alternate history. But we would ask you, if you've been thinking about that, considering that, just to give a small bit of support to us each month via Patreon. That can be done for as little as a couple of dollars a month. That helps to defray the cost of the podcast. The costs are not substantial, but they are there, and also allows us to have a little bit more freedom and to upgrade equipment and other things that go with making the podcast better. So if you've been thinking about it, you can certainly find the link in the show notes. And if you would consider doing that, if you're able to do so, it would be greatly appreciated. It doesn't need to be a large amount to support. Every amount is very much appreciated, and we understand that we don't want anybody to do more than what they're capable of doing. And as we continue to struggle in a COVID and hopefully soon post-COVID world, we understand there are a lot of folks who are recovering from the impacts of that. But if you can and you're willing, consider doing that. Again, I would encourage the non-financial support, as I mentioned earlier, word of mouth, getting the word out, social media, the other ways that you can assist and support the podcast. But Patreon is a real way that you can support us as well. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to sort of shift over into an example of what I think are going to be one of these. We don't have a name for them yet. We can call them a short. We can call them a mini. I think it just popped into my head. We may call them a forky because they're so short. But the idea of a short topic that is an interesting topic, but is not intended to be a long form. And so today the topic that I'd like to talk about is, what if there was no rural postal delivery in the United States? And let me be more clear on what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about what is known as rural free delivery, or RFD. For those of you that are older TV fans, you may remember the show starring Andy Griffith and others called Mayberry RFD. The RFD in Mayberry RFD actually referred to rural free delivery. It was actually a program that was begun by the United States Post Office in the late 19th century, and the goal of that program was to actually directly deliver mail to rural destinations. And while we have universal service today, that's another way that the Postal Service here in the United States is described, where there is delivery to every address, which is actually mandated by law. That's actually the Postal Service's mandate, which actually is a challenge for them because they have to deliver everywhere, where other folks who compete with them commercially, folks like FedEx or UPS or some of the others, actually can choose where they deliver for commercial benefit versus where they don't deliver. But the U.S. Postal Service delivers everywhere. And part of the reason that they're able to deliver everywhere was it became the stated objective and the stated criteria of the United States Postal Service under congressional mandate that they have to deliver, and that includes rural free delivery. Now, of course, it's not free in the sense of there's still stamps that have to be paid and postage and other things that have to be paid, but the cost is subsidized even down to today of what the actual costs for delivery are there. And so this was a major thing that happened when it first came online. Actually, in the late 19th century, 1896 is one of the key dates that's around that. And so what happened there before then was that folks actually had to come into town to a post office where there might have been a postal box or where mail was being held for them. If they lived in outside of a city or a town, they actually had to come into town in order to pick up that mail. The mail did not come to them. They had to come to the mail. And so it was a very common thing, particularly among farmers, ranchers, those that were in more rural settings, to actually come into town once a week, not only go to the store to pick up supplies, groceries and other things like that, but that was also coming into town to check and see if there had been anything that had been sent by mail. And so that was a big part of American culture and how American life worked up until the late part of the 19th century. With rural free delivery, things changed a little bit in the sense that now mail was actually going to be delivered out to the local location for that particular resident. And so you had things like the Sears catalog. You had delivery of items by post, catalog orders, again, being a big part of that. So Sears and Roebuck, other mail order merchants became a big deal, and they were able to take advantage of the fact that there was now rural free delivery. And so part of what happened there is it was possible for those goods to make it to the consumer without the consumer making it to the store or where they would pick those goods up. So if we're thinking about the historical what if there had not been an RFD, there's a couple of little subtle things that I hadn't really realized until I did some research on this subject and understood a little bit better. One of the biggest outcomes from the RFD, the rural free delivery, is that there was a need to have the infrastructure to make the delivery possible. Well, certainly that infrastructure includes vehicles. This is also the rise of the age of the automobile. An interesting sort of combination of that RFD is growing at the same time that the automobile is coming online to replace the horse and to replace wagons and buggies as the means of doing that. Those two things are obviously connected. There's a synergy between the two of them. But it's also, because of that, the rise of rural roads. And so one of the things that you actually have for the first time is substantial expenditures by the federal government, because the Postal Service is a federal program, is you have substantial expenditures by the federal government on roads that are not in cities or that are not part of what would eventually become the U.S. highway program. And so it did become the federal highway program initially with U.S. roads that were part of the early part of the 20th century. And then after World War II, the interstate highway system, which was also another way that the United States as a federal entity promoted and established transportation by vehicles for trucks, for passenger vehicles as well, were through those things. But prior to that, there was a need to build out the road structures for the rural free delivery. And so what that meant was there were literally tens and hundreds of thousands of miles. In fact, by 1930, almost 44,000 rural routes had been built to cover and serve almost 7 million families, or slightly more than 25 million U.S. residents, so that they could have their mail delivered to them. And when you think about in 1901, the mileage was somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 100,000 miles. And by 1930, you actually have the amount that you do, which is well over 10 times that, and that over $106 million of 1930 money had been spent on the construction of rural roads. In fact, the Rural Post Roads Act of 1916 is what began the authorization of federal funds for rural post roads. And so today we think about the quaintness of traveling down a two-lane highway or two-lane roadway in a rural part of almost every state in the union, but that came from initially was started by the direction that there would be rural delivery. And so if you did not have rural free delivery, you can easily argue that there would not have been a compelling reason, certainly not a financially likely reason, for the federal government to invest in roads that would have been almost exclusively initially for the purpose of the rural free delivery. Of course, that also had the benefit of connecting those rural residents more easily to towns and other localities. And so they became the lifeblood of the connection between small cities and small towns and the rural residents that were out there with the roads being built to deliver the mail, but those same roads also being available for those that the mail was being delivered to find their way into town. In fact, one of the interesting sort of tensions that exist in the RFD Act is there was a lot of concern by local small merchants in towns that rural free delivery would be a detriment to their business. People would not be coming into town every Saturday to check their mail and go to the store. But what they actually found over time was the availability of those roads, making it easier for folks to find their way into town, sort of balanced out those two things. And there were still some items that were not practical for delivery as part of the rural free delivery system by mail order catalog. And so there still was a need for local merchants to sort of change the types of things that they provided and change the nature of their stores, but also benefiting from the fact that there were now better roads to enable their customers to get to them from other areas that were outside of the town proper. That also led to, in other states, Texas, my native state being one of them, the development of farm-to-market roads, FM roads as we call them here in Texas. These were funded by the state, and it's true in many other states as well, where they have similar types of routes. These were roads that were intentionally built to enable produce and other items that were produced on farms and ranches to find their ways to cities. This is an outflow of the RFD situation. So once there were already rural roads that were established for the rural delivery of mail, then it was much more logical to have other roads that were established and built and funded by either state or federal government to expand out the road system in such a way that it was more, if you will, democratized. It wasn't just about whether it made sense from a dollars and cents standpoint to build that road, but it was designed to provide access to citizens on a more equal basis, equal footing, regardless of where they lived in the states or in the United States. And so one of the interesting things about the RFD, if we don't have it, this is the historical what if, is how would that have developed? It's far less likely that you would have had the number of roads that you do today that are not primary thoroughfares between major cities. And you probably would not have had the outgrowth of rural roads until much later towards the early to middle part of the 20th century with the rise of the automobile. And so one of the interesting things in my mind in terms of thinking through this historical what if is almost a chicken and egg kind of thing. Which came first? The car that wanted to take advantage of the fact that there were roads that you could drive out into the country, or whether the roads were the outflow of the vehicles, or whether the vehicles were the outflow of the roads. Well, obviously there was a synergy that took place for all the reasons that I've already mentioned that would not have developed as quickly were it not for it being established literally before the car sort of came online as a major part of transportation in the United States. And so today's historical what if, just a quick thought about how things might be different, not just in the delivery of how mail got out to rural locations, but what that meant for the delivery of people and commerce and goods and everything else back and forth. And why, even though the United States is an urban nation, it still has a very large rural and non-urban citizenship, because it's still possible to have access to what you need and not be in the big city. So there's just an example, perhaps, of what we may see a little bit more of in terms of the quick historical what-ifs that we'll hit in short episodes. That's a little bit of an example of that today as we talk about what if there had been no rural free delivery. So if you have some feedback on that, let me know. You can go again to the website where we encourage that feedback, and let us know if you like that format or even just this topic in general, whether it made sense to you or not. Well, I guess that's about it. Trying to keep things again short today. Some of the stuff that will be coming up in December and January, as I mentioned, are some of the topical suggestions that we have in our queue and our backlog from our listeners. One of the other things I didn't mention this earlier, I'd be remiss if I didn't, is we've talked about, to the extent that we're going to do some of these arcs or series, they may be done in parallel to the usual shows each week. So one of the things that does happen when we do a series, let's say we do a 4-part series like we did some of the JFK arc in November and December of this year, the good news is we string a series of shows together that have a common theme and we get the benefit of that. The bad news is we're stuck in that theme. So if you're a listener that's not particularly interested in that particular topic or that particular period of history, you sort of have to wait that out. And so one of the things that we've talked about doing with our thematic shows or our series is actually interspersing them in a way where they may run parallel with our normal show distribution schedule. And so you may see 2 shows in a given week, with one of them being part of the series. If you're interested in that, it's like having a bonus. If you're not, you'll have your regular or fork in time that comes along, and that topic will change and hopefully will vary somewhat widely given the topics that we have in the queue over time and space. So that's going to close out this episode. I'm going to close it out by just suggesting, as we always do to our listeners, if you happen upon A Fork in Time, our suggestion here from A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast, is that you take it. Talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.